Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Tonight we have a very, 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 very special discussion. I think most of you guys that are here with us in the live stream know how special this discussion is. Tonight we have Dr. Ed Feser for the first time on the channel, and then we're welcoming again Dr. Graham Oppy. He's been on the show a couple times, and it's unusual that you have two intellectual giants like this sort of sparring together in a live discussion on YouTube. It's really special. We're talking about Dr. Feser's recent book, Five Proofs of the Existence of God. Is that the way that the title goes, Ed?
Yeah, Five Proofs of the Existence of God. That's right.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Ed Feser, he's a former atheist turned Christian after he began taking the writing of Thomas Aquinas and other scholastic philosophers seriously. And if I'm not mistaken, this journey happened when you were already a philosopher in the 90s. Is that right?
Yeah, I was in grad school and I was an atheist for about 10 years, about the decade of the 1990s. And it was kind of extracurricular activity outside my dissertation work when I was teaching philosophy, religion, and the like, that I got interested in Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle and so forth in a much more serious way than I had before. And that's what sort of led to my reversion to Christianity.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm just making sure that the stream is going good. Sorry, guys. We had a bunch of little technical difficulties at the beginning of this, so everything looks like it's running smoothly. But so tell me where you're currently teaching. Is it still at Pasadena City College?
That's right.
Okay.
Pasadena City College near Los Angeles in California.
Okay. And so your primary research interests are in the philosophy of mind, moral and political philosophy, and also in philosophy of religion, obviously. But the topic of tonight's discussion, like I said, is centered on the book you wrote, Five Proofs of the Existence of God. If you guys want the link to that book, it's in the description of this video, so just check for it. It's really easy to find. It's also an affiliate link, so it'll help us out a little bit. So tonight we're going to discuss one or two of the proofs. I don't think we'll get further than that, but we'll get as far as we can. And just a little bit more on Dr. Graham Oppy. He's a good friend of Capturing Christianity. He's been on now. This will be his third time, including tonight. He's been on with Dr. Josh Rasmussen discussing the origins of reality, and then with Dr. Ben Arbor on the ontological argument. And both of those discussions are linked in the description. If you like what you see from Graham, go check out those other discussions that he's had with us. He's a PhD. He's a professor of philosophy in the School of the Philosophical and Historical and International Studies at Monash. Some of his early publications were in the areas of philosophy of language and aesthetics. Most of his recent publications have been in the philosophy of religion, though, and he's also published in metaphysics and philosophy of science. But if you guys are new to Capturing Christianity, maybe some of you are here from the recent rationality rules discussion on the Kalam cosmological argument. We host these discussions about once a month. I try to have a discussion like this once a month. And if you'd like the link to the past discussions that we've done, check for the playlist. I should have a link in the description. If it's not there, then it's real easy to find on our channel. And also, don't forget to thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get updates on when we post new videos and post new stuff. And last thing is that I just wanted to say a thank you to our patrons that have signed up recently. We've had a sort of influx of new patrons. You guys mean a lot to me. It means a lot that you want to support the work that we're doing here. So thank you very much. It really means a lot. All right, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the discussion. And so here's just like the basic outline of the way that I have planned for tonight to go. So we're going to start with the Aristotelian proof, and you're going to understand what that means in just a second. And that's basically one of the five proofs that Dr. Feser offers in the book. And so we're going to sort of lay that one out. He's also said in other interviews that I've seen him do, he says this is one of his favorites. So we'll spend a good chunk of time on that. And if we have time, we'll eventually move into the Thomistic proof, which again, we'll get to what that is later on if we have time. And then at about the 1.5 hour mark, we're going to move to a live Q&A. It's going to be a really special time. I'll tell you guys a little bit more about it as it gets closer. But let's go ahead and just move into the discussion. So Ed, take it away. Let's talk about the Aristotelian proof.
Yeah, so what I call the Aristotelian proof is an argument that's inspired by Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition. You find the earliest versions of it, I guess, in Book 8 of Aristotle's Physics and Book 12 of his Metaphysics, and then you see versions of it in Maimonides and in other medieval Aristotelians, and most famously, of course, Thomas Aquinas. It's the first of his famous five ways. and he develops it in more detail in other works like the Summa Contra Gentilis. So my version of it, what I attempt to do is to just strip away all the irrelevant historical accretions, irrelevant from my point of view anyways, some of the scientific examples in terms of which an Aristotle or an Aquinas would have developed the argument, and just to get straight to the meat of the argument. And so the way the argument goes is I start with the fact that things in the world of our experience are changing. And the example I use in my book to begin the discussion is the fact that the coffee that might be in somebody's cup as you're sitting in the office drinking, say, is growing cooler. And change on the Aristotelian analysis is the actualization of a potential. And there are reasons having to do with his response to Parmenides and Zeno and people like that, why he gives this sort of analysis, why Aristotle does and Aquinas follows him. So change is the actualization of a potential. And so when the coffee grows cooler, say, what's going on is the potential coldness of the coffee is going from potential to actual. When that happens, something's got to make it happen. And that might be, say, the coolness of the air and the surrounding environment, the environment surrounding the cup. Okay, and this is something we know from experience, that things change. And on a philosophical analysis, on the Aristotelian analysis, change involves the actualization of a potential. And when something goes from potential to actual, something already actual has to make that happen, like the coolness of the air. The air, in turn, though, is being made cool by something else that's making it go from being potentially cool to being actually cool. And that could be something like the activity of the air conditioner, say. Okay, so that allows us to introduce the idea of change as entailing the actualization of a potential. But then we move on in the argument to a deeper level, a deeper metaphysical level, because for something to change, it first has to exist. For the coffee in the cup, for example, to change, it first has to exist. And at any moment at which it's changing, it has to exist at that moment. The coffee, of course, is made up of water, and the water is made up of molecules, and the molecules are a compound of hydrogen and oxygen and so forth, the sort of thing we know from modern chemistry. Okay, so then the argument moves on to an analysis then of what makes it the case that the water in the coffee, say, the coffee itself, exists at all, even for a moment, so that it's capable of undergoing change. All right. And when I move to this level in the argument, I also move from what I call an analysis of linear series of causes, the sort of causes and effects that exist over the course of time, to a hierarchical causal series, which is the causal series that, in the paradigm case, exists at a particular moment of time. It's illustrated by Aquinas with examples like the way that you might use a stick, person, holding a stick with his hand, might use it to move a stone, say, where the stick moves the stone, but not under its own power. It can move the stone only insofar as it derives the power to move the stone from the hand and ultimately from the person. Well, in the same way, I argue that for the water that is part of the coffee to exist at any moment, that presupposes something else going on at that moment, like the potential of the molecules that make up the water, or to be more precise, say the more fundamental particles that make up the water. They have the potential to constitute either water or to constitute some other thing. And yet it's water that they constitute. Why is that the case? What actualizes that potential even at that moment? And here we've got a kind of hierarchical series where one level of reality depends on the other. And what I argue in the book is that when you follow out the logic of this hierarchical sort of causal series, it can only terminate in something that actualizes the level we started out with, the level of the water, without itself being actualized. Just like the motion of the stone is not explained by the motion of the stick until you trace to something that can move without having to be moved, namely me, say, using my hand to move the stick. In the same way, the very existence of the water cannot be explained unless there's something at the bottom level of reality that actualizes everything above it, including the water itself, without itself having to be actualized. And that would be what I call in the book a purely actual actualizer, or an unactualized actualizer, which is really another way of putting Aristotle's idea of an unmoved mover, because movement or change in Aristotle's view is the actualization of potential. So an unmoved mover is really something that actualizes without itself being actualized. And then on analysis, that turns out to be God, as Aquinas famously puts it, and this we call God, and we unpack what that would involve. So that's a little overview of the basic idea of what I call the Aristotelian proof. And of course, there are a lot of details that have to be worked out, but that's the kind of the basic thrust of the argument as I develop it in chapter 1 of 5 proofs.
So, Graham, where would you like to pick up on?
So I think let's go back to the beginning and let's just work through the premises one by one and have a discussion of them, I think. And I actually have the part of the argument from the book in front of me, so I'll just read out the premise and then say what I want to say about it, but we'll do it one at a time so we can have a discussion about whatever I say, Ed says in reply, and so on. So the first premise seems to me to be completely unproblematic, right? It's just kind of true that change is a real feature of the world. By the world here, I take it that we mean something like the causal order, right? So, but in the world of causes and effects, there's lots of change, right? So I don't really have anything else to add in connection with that premise. Second premise, change is actualization of potential. That sounds reasonable to me. I will have a comment to make later, but just to sort of think about it, suppose that you've something that at a certain time, say, is red, and then at a later time it's green, right? When it was red, it had the potential to be green. One way of thinking about this is that perhaps the most basic claim about modality is that whatever's actual is possible. Whatever is the case was potentially the case, right? So, of course, where you've got changes, you're going to have actualization of potential. Now, it may be that in some cases you have to think of the potential as being a potential of the world rather than of a particular thing. So if a thing doesn't exist, then the world has the potential for a thing like that to exist in it. It's not that the thing has some kind of potential. The comment that I wanted to make is that I don't think that the reverse is true, that the actualization of potential is change. Not always. Some actualization of potential is actualization of potential to stay the same rather than potential to change. So consider the chair in my office, and we'll think about yesterday. The chair was in my office the whole time. It's a red chair, right? And think about midday. At midday, the chair had the potential to exist at a slightly later time. It had the potential to be red at a slightly later time. When those potentials were actualized, nothing had changed. The chair was still red. It still existed. Okay. So I don't know, Ed, if you want to jump in and respond to that, or...
Well, let me say a couple of things. So the first thing I want to say is that I would actually agree with you about the first comment you made that seemed to be a point of disagreement. I don't know that it really is. You said that you agree that change involves the actualization of potential, but you wouldn't want to say it goes the other direction, that all actualization of potential is change. And I would actually agree with that. In fact, when I make the transition in the argument from the fact that, say, the water is changing temperature to the fact that it exists at all at any moment, I would say the fact that it exists at all at any moment, I argue that involves the actualization of potential, but it doesn't involve change because it's a kind of static. It's like, if we consider the existence of the water even at a particular moment, that involves the actualization of potential, but it doesn't involve change because it doesn't involve some transition through time. It rather involves something going on at a particular moment of time, say. So we can pursue that further. So I would agree with you about that. And we might just, go in different directions with that basic idea, but I don't think we necessarily disagree on the general principle. The other thing you said was go. I don't know if you wanted to follow up on that. I was just going to say that the other point you made was about the example of the chair going from red to green or green to red.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm not sure I understood the point you're trying to make with that. Were you saying that the chair goes from being, or it goes from one point in space to another, or it goes from one color to the other? Maybe you could repeat that because I'm not sure I saw the point you're trying to make.
Okay, suppose that at midday the chair is red. Then at that point, it's potentially the case that the chair is green later because someone might come in and reupholster it, for example. It's still the same chair, but it will have changed colour, right? So two premises, you conclude that actualization of potential is a real feature of the world. I'm happy with that. And we move on to the next premise. So no potential actualizes it. Now,
Hang on a second. It seems like we're having no audio right now. Maybe it's just on you.
on
One
me.
second. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're saying that the audio is gone. So 1 second. Let me.
You have audio from me?
Yeah. Yeah,
All
we do.
right.
So 1 sec. I'm going to turn on this broadcast alert. That's going to help people see that we're having some technical difficulties, and we'll restart. Okay. Okay, 1 sec. What I want to do is actually restart Skype. It looks like that might be one of the issues. So that's what I'm going to do on my end. And I'll get back
So
with you in
we
a second.
should. So then we'll have to rejoin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 1 sec.
All three of us?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll just send you a call and it should be.
Yeah.
It should fix it fine. 1 sec.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep. Yeah, I can hear Graham. Yeah. Well, I just don't have audio for you guys. Hang on a second. Actually, I think I know what it is. Here we go.
Okay, you can
There we
hear us,
go.
but you don't.
There we go. Yeah, we're good to go now.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so
Okay.
1 second. Let me start the stream back up. And so 1 sec.
Excuse me.
Okay, so let me see. All right, so how do we start back out? Okay, so I guess it's been back on. Interesting. Sorry guys, I'm having a
Okay.
lot of technical difficulties tonight. Apparently with everything. Okay, everyone's saying they're good. Everything's saying it's fixed. Okay, so let's try to pick up where we left off. I'm not exactly sure where that was, where the audio cut out for everybody. So let's just, yeah. Where do you want to be in?
Are we ready to start or?
Yeah, we're ready to start.
Yeah.
It's good to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm good to pick up where I was. If you.
All right.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So we're talking about the third of the premises in the argument. That's what we're about to start discussing. The claim that no potential can be actualized unless something already actualizes it. Now, I'm inclined to think that isn't true. And the reason why is because I think that in cases where things stay the same, when they have potential to stay the same, and that potential's actualized, in at least some of those cases, all you need is the absence of anything that would cause a change. Right? That's all it takes. So you don't need an actualizer for the the potential to stay the same. You just need the absence of anything that would defeat the thing staying the same. So to take the example of the chair in my office, in order for it to go on existing at midday for the next little period of time, and in order for it to stay red for the next little period of time, it seems to me there isn't anything that so I'm inclined to think that that premise is false, and I know Ed's not going to agree with that, so let's just pass to him now.
Okay, yeah. So what I would say about that is, first of all, remember that the way I spell the argument, I start with change as we know it from observation, and the point of that is to introduce the idea of change as the actualization. It's to introduce the general idea of the actualization of potential. I use change in order to do it because change is evident to the senses, much more than the existence of a thing at a time, where we get more metaphysical. Okay, yeah. But once I have that basic idea of the actualization of potential, I apply it to the sheer existence of a thing at any moment of time. Okay, so with that as background, let me address Graham's objection. So your objection, Graham, is you say, well, I don't see why the chair would need once it exists, why it needs something special to happen, an actualizer to keep the thing existing in the next moment, the moment after that, and so forth. And what you're appealing to is an idea that sometimes people call the idea of existential inertia, that once in existence, a thing tends to remain in existence until knocked out of existence. I'm not saying you're necessarily committed to everything people have applied to that label, associated with that label. But anyway, but you seem to be committed to something like that. Now, what I would say about that is that it's not good enough just to attribute to a thing this property of existential inertia. We need to be able to explain why it is that something would have this property. And what I would argue, and other Thomists and other classical theist philosophers would argue, is that objects that are in any way composite, and I don't want to get too far into this idea of being composite because that gets us into another proof, but it's somewhat relevant to the one we're talking about, the Aristotelian proof. Anytime you have something that's composite, it's made up of parts of some sort. It's going to exist even for an instant if those parts remain together, in which case there's going to need to be something outside it that combines those parts that it exists, in which case it doesn't have existential inertia, it doesn't have a built-in tendency to continue in existence. So to go back to the example I started out with, the one I used to illustrate the Aristotelian argument, in the case of the water, which is made up of particles, and its fundamental particles have the potentiality to constitute water or to constitute something else. Even if we just consider it at a particular snapshot of time, since it's got that potential either to be water or to be something else, but at that particular snapshot of time, it's actually water, it's not something else, then it doesn't have this kind of existential inertia. It doesn't have this attribute of continuing to exist at any moment, precisely because the microstructure, you might say, has this potentiality to be one thing rather than another, and yet it's water specifically. So we need an explanation why at that moment it's water, why it exists qua water, say, rather than something else. You could make the same point using other concepts. So as I point out in the book, if you would, an Aristotelian might say, well, what's more metaphysically fundamental than the particles even is that the water is a composite of substantial form and prime matter, and prime matter never exists on its own without substantial form, and the substantial form of a physical object never exists on its own without prime matter. So if we left it at that level of analysis, we'd have an explanatory vicious circle. So there has to be something outside that circle to account for how the thing exists at any moment. Or the Thomist would come along and say, well, the water is made up of essence and existence, and those need to be together if the thing's going to exist at any moment. So we need something outside it to actualize that at any moment. So there are different metaphysical analyses one could give in order to spell out this idea of why the thing doesn't have existential inertia. But one way or the other, I would say, insofar as it's composite, it's made up of parts of some kind, metaphysical parts of some kind, it's going to require something external to it to account for how those parts are together, in which case it doesn't have existential inertia. It doesn't have the capacity to keep existing on its own. And so it will need some external actualizer. Okay, that's the outline of
the idea. Okay, so I guess one part of my response is going to be really big, and we'll postpone it perhaps until we get to the Thomistic proof, if we get that far, which is that I don't believe in the kinds of metaphysical composition that you're talking about. Now, that's going to be a really big debate. Obviously, I do believe in the physical composition, so I agree that the water is made up of molecules, but I'm thinking that all you need for the existence of the water is the existence of the molecules in an appropriate distribution, and so long as you've got inertia at that level, you'll get it for free at the level of the water. So the decomposition, physical decomposition doesn't make an objection to the idea of existential inertia, if you want to put it like that. If you imagine this decomposition going all the way down so that there are physical simples, perhaps physics will one day tell us that there are, perhaps it won't, that is, things that have no further level of decomposition, then so long as you've got inertia for the simples, and so long as you have inertia with respect to the arrangement of the simples, then you'll have inertia with respect to the water. So it doesn't seem to me that, at least as far as physical decomposition goes, there's going to be an objection. There's going to be a serious objection here to the inertia idea. So back to you.
Okay, thank you. So, now, obviously, as you say, I mean, there are going to be more general metaphysical differences between us that would influence how we ultimately evaluate these arguments. And that would include things like the Thomistic metaphysics of substance, and how any substance is a composite of essence and existence, and then the Aristotelian stuff about form and matter. And that's all, you're perfectly correct about that. But I do think that we can bracket that off to a large extent and address the question without having to get into all that, in the following way: that you say, well, look, I mean, you can account for the existence of the water in terms of the inertia, and I take it you don't mean like Newtonian inertia, you mean existential inertia of the parts of the microstructure. Okay, fair enough. But then that just raises the question of what the metaphysics is of that kind of existential inertia at the bottom level of physical reality. And it seems to me you're inevitably going to appeal to some kind of notion of laws of nature, conservation laws of some sort, right? Together with, say, whatever the basic microparticles are that make up the physical order. Okay, well, that's all well and good, but that's just going to kick back to the question of the metaphysical status of laws of nature. What's a law of nature? Is it merely a Humean regularity? Is it a divine command? Well, obviously, you're not going to say it's a divine command, and so that's fair enough. But is it a Humean regularity? Is it a Platonic sort of entity in which the physical world participates in some way? Or is it something like what Nancy Cartwright and other neo-Aristotelian philosophers of science say it is, that it's a description of the way physical substances will tend to operate, the sort of capacities and powers they will manifest given their nature? Well, I think on any of these answers we give, there are going to be problems for the critic of the Aristotelian proof. So if you say, for example, well, a law is just a Humean regularity, I think there are a number of problems with the idea of laws as just Humean regularities, by which I mean, for those listeners who don't know this jargon, regularities as understood by a philosopher in the tradition of David Hume. So there are going to be problems with the Humean view, among which are that I think that if that's what laws are, they're just regularities, they're just descriptions of what actually obtains, then laws no longer really explain anything, they just describe, in which case an appeal to a law understood in Hume's terms wouldn't be an alternative explanation to the one I'm giving, it would just not be an explanation at all. Or if you say, well, no, laws are something like Platonic entities in which the world participates, then that just kicks the problem back of, well, okay, but why does the world participate in the laws that it does rather than some other laws or no laws at all? Or if you take a kind of Nancy Cartwright view of laws as descriptions, a shorthand description of the way something will operate given its nature, then the laws are actually parasitic on something deeper, namely the existence of the physical substances that follow the laws, in which case we need an explanation of why those things exist at all. And we couldn't appeal to to laws to explain that, since the laws always piggyback on substances. So laws would never be, on that account, be the deepest level of reality. In which case, an appeal to so-called laws of existential inertia wouldn't be an ultimate explanation, since that would piggyback on something deeper. And so we will not have reached our final explanation. So it seems to be on any account of law that we want to appeal to, it's not really going to provide an alternative explanation to the sort that I claim the Aristotelian argument gives us.
Okay, so there's not much I disagree with in what you said. And I guess at the most general level, I'm inclined not to take laws of nature seriously. I'm more inclined towards a kind of powerism. So I think that
would you mind explaining that for me and the audience? What you mean by
okay,
that?
so it's close to the position that Ed was attributing to Nancy Cartwright, the last position, right? So you can think of the laws, insofar as we're going to talk about laws, as somehow or other, it's not exactly summarizing, but it's something like that. The powers of things, right? So what's fundamental is you've got objects with certain kinds of powers, right? And it's not that there are laws that govern, right? That's seems to me to be a very, very bad way of thinking about the laws. And it's not that laws are just summaries of regularities either. There's something too superficial about the regularities for the laws to just merely be summaries of them. So, however, it seems to me that there's nothing wrong with the idea that you think of the powers of things, and one of the basic powers of things is this power to go on existing unless something intervenes to defeat the existence. Right, so that seems to me to be the base level here. There's no deeper explanation than that, but it's a perfectly adequate explanation. Now you've got an understanding of the way the universe goes on existing, because it and all of the things within it have this power that's not defeated. On my view, there's nothing external to natural reality that could cause it to go out of existence. Perhaps, depending upon how the physics goes, there could be a kind of internal reason the universe might collapse in on itself, and if the expansion halted and it shrunk back in, and it might disappear. But assuming that the universe goes on expanding, there's nothing, no external thing that can defeat its power to go on existing. That's the basic picture. It seems that to me that it's a nice, simple picture, and that it's adequate to the phenomena as well. So it's got plenty to recommend it.
Well, if I could respond to that, I would say that the problem I see with it is that if we think of what I've been calling existential inertia as a kind of power of a thing to go on existing, once it exists, to keep on existing, but then we combine that with the idea of laws of nature, and so we say that the law of existential inertia describes the operation of the power of a thing to go on existing and so forth. But then we say, well, laws are really, they're less metaphysically fundamental than the powers a thing has, and the powers of a thing depend on the substance that has those powers, the entity that has them, whatever term we want to use. Then we have a problem that it seems like we're going around in kind of a circle here. So we're explaining a thing's continued existence in terms of its power of existential inertia, but the power of existential inertia exists only qua attribute of the substance that has it. So we have to explain the thing's continued existence in terms of its power of existential inertia, but its power of existential inertia exists only insofar as it inheres in the thing that has that power. So we're going around kind of a circle, in which case we need to break out of that circle in order to have an ultimate explanation. So it seems to me like treating existential inertia as kind of a power is really the last move you can make if you're going to accept the Cartwright-style view of laws as grounded in powers, since powers in turn presuppose the substances that have them.
I'm not sure where laws came into this. I wasn't thinking that there's a law of existential inertia. I was thinking that things have powers to go on existing, and that's the kind of metaphysical rock bottom.
Oh, okay. Well, but
Right.
in that
So
case, I think that. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no. So uh, no, that'll do. I mean, that because
I
that
mean,
is what I think.
well, I think in that case, it seems to me the problem is even more direct because a power is metaphysically parasitic, you might say, on the substance that has the power. So a thing can have any power at all, including the power of existential inertia, only if it exists in a way that can ground the power. So if the thing exists and that's what grounds its existential inertia, but its existential inertia is what causes it to exist or accounts for how it exists, then we've got a kind of explanatory vicious circle. That's the problem that I was trying to
Right.
identify. And if we knock laws out of the picture, then it's a more direct circle rather than a,
Okay.
more of a
So
loop.
so maybe at this point we should move on to the next premise because the I want to say something about the
I was
next
actually
premise that will count as a response to what you just said.
I was actually
Okay.
going to ask, yeah, could you help summarize? Because we've gone through a lot, and to be honest, I've been a little out of the loop because I've just been focused on the audio, making sure that it's working and everything is solid. So, would you mind taking just a minute and explaining sort of where we are in the argument so far? Because we're still talking about the Aristotelian proof. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Either one of you guys, I'm sure, will be able to summarize it for us.
Yeah.
the
Okay.
audience.
So
Yeah, we're at
I'll
what you
Ed,
call
you go
step.
ahead.
I'm sorry, Greg. We're at. It's funny. You have my argument in front of you, and I don't. So I'm going to go on my memory of what you identified as the steps of the argument. So I think we're at what you referred to as step 3, if I remember correctly, which is that what goes from potential to actual requires something already actual as a cause, or something like that. Is how I put it. I think is that right?
Yeah,
That's where we're
that's
at.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at. That's where we're at, Cameron. We've been kind of talking around that issue.
And so, Graham, have you rejected that claim? I suppose you have.
I said that I think that it's false, and then we've been arguing backwards and forwards, really, about whether the claim's true, whether it's false, reasons that you might have, one way or the other. So can I proceed to the seventh claim? And just to mention a kind of objection, and then we'll come back to where we are in the discussion of the third premise, right? So the existence of a thing at any given moment itself presupposes the concurrent actualization of its potential for existence. Right, so that's the claim. If you're thinking about things that way, then my claim that it's sort of at the ground level, things have potential to go on existing might seem problematic, right? But what I'm thinking is that at any time, if you think about a thing at a time, if the thing exists at that time, then it doesn't have the potential to exist at that time. It may be true that it had the potential to exist at that time at earlier times, and it may be that it's got the potential now to exist at later times. But if it's actually existing now, it doesn't also have the potential to exist now. That's not how potentials work. And so it's not right that in order for this thing to exist now, we're presupposing that something's actualizing its potential to exist now, because it doesn't have a potential to exist now. At earlier times, it had a potential to exist at later times. That's what there is. So if we go back to this idea about the fundamentality, the thing at a time has a potential to exist at later times. Its existence now, if it existed earlier, is a realization of its potential to exist at earlier times. So I don't see that there's any kind of vicious circularity here, but I also think that that claim about concurrent actualization is false. Now, why do I think that it's false? So suppose that a thing is F, right? And you say, so it's actually F. And you say, I can't be actually F unless it's potentially F, right? So it's actually potentially F. But the move from thinking actuality requires potentiality is going to repeat itself. If it's actually potentially F, it better be potentially F. And if it's actually potentially F, it better be potentially F. And this is a regress, and by your lights, it's going to be vicious. And the only non-arbitrary way to cut it off is right at the beginning. So you shouldn't have made that move that said in order to be actually F, you've got to be potentially F concurrently. By my lights, that's a metaphysical error, I'll say. I just think that claim's false.
Okay. So let me respond to that. And I want to say two things about it. One of them is by my lights, the less deep point to make. And then the other one's by my lights, the deeper point to make. And your mileage may vary, of course. So what I'm calling the less deep point is that even if we were to accept the line of criticism you just gave, that, once the thing exists at a particular point in time t, then, okay, it has the potential to exist at some later time, t plus 1, say, but at t it's actual and no longer potential, so there's nothing remaining needing to be explained. Well, there would still need to be an explanation of why it continues to exist at t plus 1, and I suppose someone defending the kind of argument that I'm giving might go in that direction, and then sort of formulate the argument in those terms so as to get around your objection. But that's what I'm calling what I think is the less deep point. The deeper, more important point, for the way I actually try to spell out the argument, is that even at the particular moment of time t, I think you're misinterpreting the claim I'm making. So I'm not saying that just to make it concrete, the water of my example is both actually in existence at t and potentially in existence at t. Of course, I couldn't say that because it's a point Thomas himself makes and Aristotle makes, that nothing's potential and actual in the same way at the same time. So that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the water exists at t because the potential, not of the water itself, but of the microstructure of the water, say the particles that constitute the water, is actualized as water as opposed to their potential to be some other thing being actualized at t. Or another way to put it, as I noted a few minutes ago, we could think of it as the prime matter that makes up the water had the potential to be water or to be gasoline or to be, cat food or any number of other things at t, and yet it's not any of those other things at t. It's actually water at t. So what actualized that potential? Or a third way to construe this, the water is made up of both essence and existence. And so something the essence by itself on a Thomistic analysis is merely potential until actualized by having existence added to it. And so that something has to cause that to happen at t. So it's not that the water itself is both potential and actual at t. It's you might see these constituents of the water, either physical or metaphysical, which need to be actualized at t. And that's how the argument proceeds.
Right. So then we come back to the kind of thing I said before. I don't believe in any of the kinds of metaphysical composition, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And it seems to me that, making the plausible assumption that the physical composition bottoms out in physical simples, we just make the point about simples. There's now no question about composition, right? There's no worry. If you've got simples, there's no worry about composition. And so we just apply the point to them. Right, they have the potential to go on existing at later times, and we're back to the claim about this being rock bottom. The way that I see it, what this throws all of the future discussion, the weight of the future discussion is now on the questions about metaphysical composition. I don't know, maybe you don't agree with that. Maybe you still want to push the point in connection with physical composition.
Yeah. Well, let me try to push the point in terms of physical composition just a little bit further. So you just said, well, your answer to what I just said would be just to appeal to an alternative metaphysics, and that would be sufficient to do the job. And I guess this is where a variation on the point that we were addressing 5 or 10 minutes ago would come in. So you say, well, if we just take everything down to the physical simples and put aside all this Thomistic and Aristotelian stuff about essence and existence and form and matter and so forth. Now, of course, the Aristotelian would say, well, if we're talking about physical simples, like if we're talking about atoms of the Democritean sort, say, even those on an Aristotelian analysis would have to be composites of form and matter in order to make sense of them. Okay, but again, let's put that aside for the moment. Well, we'd still be down to physical simples, and we'd have to ask, okay, but what is it about these physical simples that gives them this remarkable feature of existential inertia? And they're going to be maybe two possible answers. One of them would be, well, they're the physical simples together with some sort of conservation laws that ensure that they will persist in existence. if we go that route, which I think you would not, which I know from what you said earlier you would not go in, but a lot of naturalists would go that route. So if a naturalist takes that route, I would say, well, the problem there is, once again, we do have composition there because we've got the fundamental particles together with the laws. We need to ask, how do those get together, as it were? And so we're sort of back where we started. But you wouldn't go that route. You'd say, no. We'll just put laws aside and think in terms of the powers of these physical simples, including a power of existential inertia. Well, then I would raise the objection that I raised 10 or 15 minutes ago, whenever it was, which is that the problem with that is that powers presuppose substances for their existence. So to explain why the power exists, as it were, we need to appeal to the substance that has the power. But the whole point of the power of existential inertia was supposed to be to explain the existence of the substance that has it, so that we'd have an explanatory vicious circle here. We'd be explaining the existence of the substance in terms of its power of existential inertia, but then we'd have to explain its power of existential inertia, like all its other powers, in terms of the existence of the substance, so that we'd have, again, an explanatory vicious circle.
So I guess that doesn't seem right to me. So if you think about continuing this assumption or pretense that there are simples, if you've got a physical simple with a power to go on existing, and not only to go on existing, but to go on existing with the powers that it's got now, so that the as it were, the inertia here isn't just with respect to existence, but with respect to powers as well, then it doesn't seem to me that there's any kind of circle, right? There's just an assumption about what there is at the base here. There are simples with certain powers. Those powers include powers to exist with those powers at later times. That's what gets carried over. Right. So I don't see that there's any, I certainly don't see that there's any composition worry in this, but I'm not sure that I'm seeing that there's a kind of circularity worry either yet.
Well, let me put it this way. Let's just think of another example, another sort of power. So if we think of the phosphorus in the head of the match as having the power to generate flame and heat when you strike the match, the power is not a free-floating sort of thing. The power exists only qua power of the phosphorus. We could take the phosphorus as the physical substance that has the power. Sure. So in that way, a power is metaphysically parasitic on the substance that has it. But if that's true of the power to cause flame and heat, which the phosphorus has, it would also have to be true of the phosphorus's purported power of existential inertia. The power of existential inertia would presuppose the substance, but then we're back to this explanatory vicious circle in that the power of existential inertia, like any other power, presupposes the existence of the substance. And so if we say, well, the power exists because the substance underlies it, but the substance that underlies it exists only because it has this power, then we're in this metaphysical circle at the bottom level of physical reality. And we need to break out of it in order to avoid the problem.
Well, perhaps partially anticipating things that we're going to say later, I wouldn't want to say that the powers exist. Things have powers, right? Powers are not a kind of existence. Existent, however, right? So it's because that view's the kind of composition view, right? There's one existent, the thing, and there's another existent, the power, and then you have to combine them together, right? That's not the metaphysical picture that I've got, right? There's things with powers, right? I mean, it's in this sense that it's appropriate to say the simple has the power to go on existing, or the simple has the power to go on existing with the power to go on existing.
So what do you? I don't
want a decompositional analysis of that at all.
So
well, I think
get clear on.
Yeah, go ahead, Cameron.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to get clear on what we mean by simple. Is that just like an entity, or what do we mean by simple?
So a simple is something that has no decomposition. It doesn't have parts that it can be decomposed into.
Okay.
Not even kind of.
So let's give a concrete example of something. Would that be like a quark?
Or
whatever fundamental particle you want to like.
Well, so possibly, but
yeah.
I mean, given the state of physics, it might be that the quarks turn out to be simples. They have no structure. They have no internal structure. But I doubt that would be the case, actually, and it's kind of hypothetical whether
Right.
there is a level at which physics bottoms out in things that have no structure.
So Ed, do you think that there is no such thing as a simple other than God that has the power to go on existing on its own?
Well, I think there's no such thing as an absolutely simple substance. Something might be relatively simple. So, I mean, I don't want to go too far afield yet from the Aristotelian proof, but Aquinas offers the examples of angels. And of course, for Aquinas, an angel isn't the creature with the long golden hair and the gowns and all that and the wings. It's an entity of pure intellect. So it's a thing that thinks, and that's all it is. It's something kind of like a Cartesian res cogitans. Okay. For Aquinas, an angel, so understood, is a kind of simple. It's simple relative to physical objects, say, because it's not a compositive form and matter. It's just a pure form, or to be more precise, it's a substance that has a form or nature like anything else does, but it's not embedded in matter. So that's relatively more simple than a physical object would be. But it doesn't have the simplicity that Aquinas attributes to God, where for God there isn't even a distinction, as there is even in an angel, between its essence and its existence. So I would say if we're talking about absolute simples, then yes, there's nothing absolutely in simple or simple in an unqualified way other than God for the Thomist, or I would say for the Aristotelian for that matter. But if we're talking about simples in a more qualified way, in a relative sense, where and I took Graham to be talking about something at least, I don't know, vaguely analogous to fundamental particles, and not without being committed to the current list that we see in contemporary particle physics, because that's always subject to revision. But something perhaps more basic than that. Well, for one thing, I mean, I think Graham is absolutely right in what I think is implicit in what he's been saying, which is that we're going to have to not think of these exactly on the model of what Austin calls the middle-sized dry goods of everyday experience. They're going to be very different from tables and chairs and so forth. But it seems to me like something like the substance, attribute, structure is going to have to exist at the level of these fundamental particles as well. So just like you take an object like an apple, and you've got the apple as the object, and then the redness of the apple, which is a property of the apple, and the power of the apple, say, to roll. If you drop it on the table, say, it'll roll a little bit. Well, just like the redness doesn't exist in a freestanding way, it exists only in the apple that has it. Seems to me the same thing's to be true of the power of the apple to roll, or the power of the flesh of the apple to, moisten a piece of paper that's placed on, say, if you cut it open and the juice flows out and so forth. So in that sense, and I think that's the only sense I need for my point, the power is parasitic on the substance that has it, just as the property, the redness of the apple, is parasitic on the substance that has it. And it seems to me that would be as true of the micro level simples that Graham is positing as it would be of a macro level object like an apple. And in that case, we have some kind of composition, or if you don't want to call it composition, we have a kind of you might say metaphysical dependence of one thing on the other, of the power, just as a property would be dependent on the substance that has it. And I think once we have that, even if we're not talking about form and matter, we're not talking about essence and existence, and I can put all that aside, we still do have a substance power distinction, which is what I'm claiming poses the circularity problem for Graham's position.
Well, now I'm really curious how Graham's going to respond to this.
So you can probably guess that there'll be something that looks like a kind of nominalism that's coming in here. So I'm quite happy to say the apple is red. I'm not so happy with talk about redness, unless we understand that that's just a kind of convenient way of talking about claims like the claim that the apple is red. So when I talked before about powers, and at other times I'll talk about properties, I would actually prefer a kind of view on which that kind of talk, I take it, is justified because it increases the sort of expressive power of our language, but it doesn't involve any ontological commitment. So I don't think that there are powers, and I don't think that there are properties. and so on. So the kind of view that, for example, Steve Yablo defends, his figuralist approach to abstract objects generally, is something that I'm quite sympathetic to. Right, so it's it was sort of somewhat incautious of me to talk about without explaining first the way that I'm going to understand this talk about powers, because there'll be sentences like this, that the simples will go on existing unless something intervenes to stop them from existing. Right, that's kind of more like what the kind of rock bottom expression of the view is going to look like.
Do you mind if I just try to get a little bit more clarification on the view here? So
sure.
Okay, so my phone, would you say that my phone has a certain amount of power? I know we're not talking about fundamental like particles right now.
Yeah. So if I wanted to be really careful about what I was committing myself to, and if I knew more about phones, I would say something like the charge of the battery is 67% or something like that. There'd be a way of saying what you said in a way that didn't commit me to there being properties, right? I wouldn't have to say, well, look, no, the phone has this property that its battery is, right. That would just be, by my lights, in that kind of expression, that one. So the phone has the property of being charged 67%. The use of the word property there is just dispensable. I could have just said the charge on the phone is 75%.
But you'd agree in the case of the phone, you would still agree though that there's an explanation for why it's at that percentage of battery or why it has that power.
Yeah.
Is that enough for you, Ed, to move?
Well, I mean, I wanted to say a couple of things about Graham's response there, which I find very interesting. So Graham appeals to a kind of nominalism, and of course, that raises all kinds of metaphysical issues. Like Graham said earlier, this kind of discussion is inevitably going to end up in much more general metaphysical issues than just theism. But if we can forestall that just a little bit longer, I think I could still push back. And the way I would do so is to say, well, okay, if you're going to make that sort of move and say, look, I mean, all the talk about properties and powers, it's just kind of a ladder that I'm climbing, and ultimately I can kick it away and not take that to be metaphysically very robust. I don't really need to in order to make my point and so forth. Well, I mean, one point I would make about that, in addition to all the other realist, nominalist sort of points that would come up, is that we have the kind of Hilary Putnam no miracles objection that talk of powers and properties and the like does so much work in setting up the very position that it would be a kind of miracle if there's nothing in objective reality, including nothing in the nature of the particles that we're positing here that corresponds to it. We'd be eliminating one mystery, namely the mystery of that has to do with the circularity problem that I was identifying, by appealing to another mystery, which is that these particles operate in a way that's as if they had powers, even though power talk is ultimately just kind of a convenient fiction or a figure of speech to make reference to the figureless position you're talking about earlier. So that's just a general problem that's often raised for anti-realism in general, and that's one point I would make. Another point I would make, though, is that the more you want to really press on this idea that I'm gonna find a way to get around that objection to anti-realism here, and I'm just going to bite the bullet and affirm a kind of identity. I don't know if that's the way you want to put it, but something like an identity between the thing and the powers of the thing, that there's no real distinction there between the simple itself and the powers that it has. Well, then it seems to me I've got an interesting outcome, which is that these simples that your position has to postulate really start to sound suspiciously like the absolutely simple, purely actual actualizer that I was trying to get us to in the first place. And so then you'd have a problem distinguishing the absolute simple or simples that you're postulating from the Aristotelians or the Thomist conception of God. So it would be a kind of Pyrrhic victory if you really wanted to press on the idea that all talk about a distinction between powers and the substances that have them and all these the properties of the thing and the thing itself dissolve. Well, then it looks like you're really where I am, and you're just using different language to describe it.
So And this is a point that you make in the last chapter of the book as well. I certainly don't myself think that I'm affirming some kind of identity between two things, because I'm denying that there is one of the things, right? So I kind of reject to that. I would object to that way of putting it. Also, though, it depends a bit, because just taking the last point, it feels like it's going to be a rather more polytheistic than your view, because there are lots and lots of individual simples, right? And we're saying about each of them that there's this identity there. It doesn't look as though on the physical view you're going to identify them all. So it's not really going to turn out to be exactly there's what was supposed to be proved by the proofs here, that there's just one unactualized actualizer, or just one, it feels like you're not going to get, it might not turn out to be a coherent view, but it seems like, at least initially, it's not going to turn out to be your favorite kind of theism.
Right. Well, so what I would say to that is that the trouble is that if you press hard on the absence of a real distinction in these fundamental simples, and we'll keep it in the plural, simples in the plural.
Yeah.
So that there really isn't in there, a distinction between the substance that has the properties and the properties themselves, or the substance that has the powers and the powers themselves. Okay, so yeah, these simples, man, they're really simple. Okay, well then we need to ask, okay, but then how are these different purportedly distinct simple entities? How are they? What is it that makes them distinct from one another? We're going to have to give some principle of individuation. Now, as you know, Aquinas would say, well, whenever you've got different members of the same species in the logical and metaphysical sense of species, not the biological sense, then the principle of individuation is going to have to be matter. So in this case, these purportedly distinct simples would have to be associated with different parcels of matter. But then once you say that, then you've got composition again of the kind that I think you're not going to want to have. Yeah. And I think that any other way to distinguish them is going to involve some kind of composition, or it's going to involve some appeal to laws outside them that determine that one of these simples is at this point in space, given the laws of nature and the pre-existing conditions, and the other one's at that point in space. And then we've got other kind of composition, namely the simples and the laws that govern them. So I'm aware that you would say, well, this would lead me at most to a kind of a polytheistic position. But I think that the problem with that is that would itself be unstable, that you'd have to give some account of how these distinct simples are distinct. And then you're going to be led to say, actually they aren't distinct. There's just one ultimately simple entity. And then we're back with essentially Aristotelian theism.
Right. So, just pursuing this line of thought a little bit further, I think that maybe somebody like Jonathan Schaffer wants to go as far as saying that there is just one fundamental physical simple, or something like that. Anyway, it's not a line I'm interested in. I'm not interested in going that way, because what I want to say is that there'll be, if we imagine that there are lots of simples, there'll be different true things that we can say about the different simples, at least in principle. Assuming we had access to this domain, and there'll be true claims about their relative positions. There may be, the simples may differ in other ways, like some of them might have one kind of charge and some might have another kind of charge. So it will be true to say this one's positively charged, that one's negatively charged, and so on. But it won't be the case, on the view that I'm imagining, that, I said incautiously they have one kind of charge, they have another kind of charge, but the claims that will be true are things like this one's positively charged, that one's negatively charged. And that will be at a kind of fundamental level.
Well,
it won't be that. It won't be that there's anything else, a deeper level at which you can explain why this thing's negatively charged or why this thing's positively charged. You'll have hit theoretical rock bottom at that point.
Right. So let me say a couple of things to that. So first, as you say, there are naturalists who would bite the bullet and say, yeah, let's just one ultimate simple, and we can call it the universe as a whole or whatever. And if someone goes in that direction, then I think that they're well on the way to the outcome that I described. That they're really, without realizing it, affirming a kind of theism of the Aristotelian or Thomistic or Neoplatonic sort, and then it's just a matter of what's the nature of this entity that they've arrived at, and they're going to be hard pressed to avoid attributing to it the kind of divine attributes that the Aristotelian or Thomist or Neoplatonic theists would attribute to it. Okay, so but you say, okay, you're not going to go in that direction. Okay, so fair enough. So then the issue is, okay, but if you're going to stick with the multiple simples, there's got to be some way to individuate them, and you suggested it might be something like a difference in charge. I know you're not committed to charge per se as the difference, but that that's kind of a working model. But the problem with that, it seems to me, is that that's going to bring some kind of real composition in. If I've got particle A and particle B, and I want to say there's no real distinction in either one of them between the particle considered as an entity or substance, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the properties or powers of the particle. Each of them is just kind of a unity. I mean, a real simple with this capital S, say, in a robust sense. But the way they differ is one has a negative charge and one has a positive charge. Then it's hard to make sense of that, in particular how that's going to do any sort of explanatory work, unless we're some kind of realist about a property like charge. And if we're realists about it, then it seems like we're bringing some kind of composition back in, and then we're back with the sort of problems that I was trying to raise for you earlier. Whereas if we say, no, we're not realists about charge and any other property, then we're back with the other problem that we don't really have a principle of individuation after all. So that the positionally seems to work if we don't disambiguate between these two ways to construe it, these two alternatives that I say it falls into, one or the other.
So I'm not sure. I mean, thinking just about realism, I take it that it's just true that the simples, some simples are negatively charged, some simples are positively charged. In that sense, I'm a realist about charge. But I don't think that each simple is a composite of form and matter, or the substance and attribute, or something like that. I don't buy into that kind of metaphysics, right? So in that sense, I'm an anti-realist, but I'm not denying that the simples have that it's correct to say this simple's negatively charged and that one's positively charged. And that seems to me to be the important question about whether I'm a realist or an anti-realist, but maybe that's,
Yeah, I guess I just want to, even putting aside the specifically Thomistic stuff about essence and existence and so forth. So I'm willing to bracket that for the purposes of this specific point. It seems to me like if you're gonna distinguish the particles by reference to positive versus negative charge or anything else you might want to appeal to, and then you're gonna affirm a kind of realism therefore about charge, then we're saying, okay, particle A has negative charge, particle B doesn't. And so particle A has something the other one doesn't have. And what is that something if it's not something distinct from the entity that has it? And in which case we're back to realism about properties and or powers. If we just say, well, they're just different, and the differences don't involve a difference in properties or powers, because we don't want to be realists about properties and powers, then it seems like we don't have really an explanation. We've just got a kind of bare assertion. And then now here this might be the point where we're led into more general metaphysical questions like the principle of sufficient reason. But it seems that we're going to be led to some kind of just brute fact that there's just a brute difference between them. And the brute difference has to do with negative versus positive charge. But negative versus positive charge doesn't have to do with one having a power or property that the other lacks in some robust sense. Because if you don't want to be a realist about powers and properties. To me, even putting aside the question of principle of sufficient reason, it seems to be like I'm having trouble getting a handle on what the position even is if we're going to say there's a difference there, but it's not a difference in the powers or properties they have. But even if we could put some content on it, we'd have the problem that it's going to be a brute difference. It's going to posit brute facts, therefore it's going to violate the principle of sufficient reason. And as you know, I I would affirm the principle of sufficient reason, though that would take us into broader metaphysical issues.
Yeah.
But
So, Graham,
that's the sort of family of problems that it seems to face the position.
So, Graham, before you come back on that, I just wanted to let the listeners know we're going to do something special tonight. We're going to have a Patreon-only question and answer time. And the link to the question and answer video that we're going to be using is in the description of this video. So if you want to ask questions to Graham and Ed, then make sure to sign up on our Patreon. Anything over $5 a month is going to get you access to the question and answer period that we're going to have. And actually, we're going to start that fairly soon because time has already flown by. We got about another 10 minutes before we're going to wrap up, and then we're going to move to the question and answer period. So check for the link in the description if you want to participate in the question and answer time, and I'll hand it back over to you, Graham.
Okay, sorry, now I've lost my train of thought. It's one question whether you say something like this simple is positively charged. It's another question whether there's some informative analysis of that you can give that brings in its train a bunch of metaphysical commitments. So whether in some sense saying that commits you to there being properties or powers or whatever. And another question, which I want to distinguish, is whether you'll be happy to say certain kinds of things. So, for example, that you might be happy to say that the simple has the property of being negatively charged and take that to be a kind of just a trivial notational variant of saying that the thing is negatively charged without thinking that there's any metaphysical commitment that goes along with it. If in your theory you say sort of at the bottom there's a bunch of simples that are positively charged and a bunch of simples that are negatively charged, and that's your if you're thinking about the present, you think everything's constructed out of that, let's suppose. I mean, that's obviously not how it is, but let's just pretend. I don't see that there's anything here that even prima facie going to be a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, because there'll be an explanation of the existence of these simples here and now in terms of the existence of things earlier. Right, remember the idea of the conservation. We'll call it, the inertia of existence, etc. Right. So I don't actually see why there's a looming threat of violation of principle of sufficient reason if you were to take this line.
Well, the reason the reason I said that I suggested there's a threat of violating the principle of sufficient reason was simply that it seemed like you wanted to individuate the fundamental simples, A and B, say, in terms of charge. One has positive charge, one has negative charge, and at the same time not be a realist about charge considered as a property, say, not because you don't want to be a realist about properties in general. And the point I was trying to make was that, well, if we say they differ with respect to charge, but charge is not a sort of property that one has and the other lacks because there are no properties. We still want to collapse properties into their bearers, say, then what we seem to have is just a brute difference. We can't say anything more about what it is to have a positive versus negative charge, other than that it's a difference that A and B have. And therefore a kind of brute difference. And so I was taking that to entail a kind of brute fact about them. And it's the brute fact about them that I would say violates PSR. Another thing I want to say, though, is that maybe you want to interject at that point, or I could make this other point and you could respond to both of them. It's up to you.
Okay, so let's take this point. So I guess there are two ways you can go. I mean, one way you can go is just thinking that there are different kinds of simples. I mean, to speak with the vulgar, right? And that really is rock bottom, at least as far as the present's concerned. You may have a historical explanation of how it came to be that there are different kinds of simples. But you might also think that there's just one kind of simple, and somehow or other the variation in properties emerges from the different ways in which the simples are combined into composite objects, right? That's also not ruled out at this stage, I guess. So that was the kind of small point that I thought I'd make.
But we still need to be able to distinguish the simple, even if they're the same kind, they'd have to be different instances of the same kind. And so what I was suggesting is that individuating them as distinct instances of the same kind is going to land you in a problem if the way you individuate them is by reference to properties, since that would introduce composition. And then if you say, well, no, I don't want to be a realist about properties, then we're left with just, a brute difference between them, which brings us to the PSR, the violation of PSR problem. It's just a brute fact that they're different.
But the individuation could be like this. There's one, there's another, there's another, there's another, right? And in that, I wasn't appealing to any properties, right? You might think that underlying that individuation, there's a spatial distribution, and we're talking about the relative spatial positions of things relative to me, and that seems fine. But that was all I relied on in order for there to be individuation of these things. Right, but they can be. If you want to put it that way, this one's different from this one because they occupy a different position in a global spatial arrangement.
Well, but what I'm asking though is what makes it the case that the spatial arrangements are different. So if we said, for example, and I know at this level that we're talking about, we're not talking about material objects of the kind with which we're familiar with everyday experience. Fair enough, but nevertheless, if we say, okay, they're somehow spatially separated, then we need an account of what causes or explains the spatial separation. It seems to me like to appeal to something like spatial separation ultimately presupposes that they're distinct, and therefore can't explain what makes them distinct. Let me just throw in one more point because I know we're almost out of time here, I know it's crazy. And I wanted to make this other point though a couple of minutes ago, which is that another problem it seems to me with taking this route is that if you say, okay, so the fundamental simples have a property of existential inertia, but we're not or a power of existential inertia, but we're not really going to be realists about power. So the power of existential inertia, like every other power, collapses into the bearer. They're ultimately identical. That starts to sound to me suspiciously like the Thomist idea that God is identical to his existence. The power of existential inertia is identical to the bearer of the power. That's like Aquinas saying that God's existence is identical to God himself. And so we're back with this, just a riff on this general problem that I'm suggesting faces your view, that it's going to be a sort of backdoor entry into theism when the whole point was to try to avoid theism.
So I think what would be good now, but it seems like we're going to run out of time, would be to move on to discuss the Thomistic proof, and in particular the idea that there's a distinction between essence and existence, and then after that to go on and maybe discuss the other distinction between form and matter as well.
Well, let me just ask you guys.
It looks as though we're not going to have enough time.
Would you be open to doing a part 2 sometime in the future? Not necessarily right now or in a week or in a month or anything, but we could schedule it out as far as we wanted to. Is that something you guys would be open to?
I'd be open to it.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, a lot of people are actually asking in the live chat because we haven't gotten super far in the discussion and everyone kind of wants more and more and more, which is typically how these things go. Once you start to get into the weeds, it just, time flies basically. So why don't we take just about 10 minutes or so and talk about the Thomistic proof, and then we'll move into closing remarks and then to Q&A.
Okay, so do you want to start or?
Oh yeah. So the Thomistic proof, this is it's so called because it's identified with Thomas Aquinas, though it's a proof that Aquinas, in formulating it, was influenced by earlier thinkers like Avicenna in the Islamic medieval philosophical tradition. And the basic idea is that the Thomistic proof argues that we need to draw a distinction in a thing between its essence, or what it is, and its existence, or that is to say, the fact that it is, if indeed it is existent, if indeed it is real. And one way to look at this distinction and to see why, for Aquinas, there must be such a distinction is in terms of the following sort of example, which I give in the book. Suppose you're talking to somebody, maybe a little kid, who's never heard of three different animals: a lion, a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and a unicorn. And so you describe for him what each of these things is. You're describing the essence of each of these creatures, the essence of what it is to be a lion, the essence of what it is to be Tyrannosaurus Rex, and the essence of a unicorn. And then suppose he's got a photographic memory and he's got perfect understanding of everything you told him, so he gets it. And you say, okay, now let me ask you, of these three creatures, one of them exists, still does, you could see it at the zoo. One of them used to exist but has gone extinct, and a third never did exist but is purely fictional. Which is which? Well, Aquinas points out that someone who knows that would not be able to tell you which is which. Knowledge of the essence wouldn't give you knowledge of the existence. So the existence of a thing, you might say, is an additional principle. It's an additional aspect of it, put it that way, distinct from its essence. Its essence and existence are distinct. Okay. Now, if its essence and existence are distinct, then that means that for a thing having a certain essence to be real, to be a feature of the world around us, existence has to be added to it. For lions to exist, and you need not just the essence or nature of being a lion, lioness, if that's a word. Well, lioness means something else, but anyway, the essence of being a lion. You need existence added to that. Okay. And that's as true for Aquinas at any moment that a thing exists as it is when it first comes into being, because it's not just when a lion first comes into being that its essence and existence are distinct, but at any moment at which it exists, its essence and existence are distinct. So there needs to be something external to it. It can't be the thing itself, on pain of self-causation, which is impossible for Aquinas, and I think he's right in saying that's impossible. It has to be something distinct from the thing that accounts for how its essence has existence imparted to it. And that's true here and now, not just at some point in the past. And if that thing, let's call it C, which is causing its essence to have existence imparted to it, it itself has a distinction between its essence and its existence. There'd have to be some further thing, B, which accounts for C's existence, so C can account for the lion's existence here and now. And what we've got here is another instance of what I referred to earlier and what I describe in the book as a hierarchical causal series, where the intermediate causes are absolutely inert unless there's a first cause which gives them power to produce the ultimate effect. And in this case, this causal series has to trace downward to something in which there is no distinction between its essence and its existence. Its very essence just is to exist. Its very essence just is to be, as it were. That, in outline, is what I call the Thomistic proof.
Right. So I agree that there's a distinction that we can draw between being essentially F and being accidentally F. So it might be that I'm accidentally human, but essentially possessed of a particular genetic makeup, for example. Maybe that's not the best example to give, but anyway, that will do. But I think that in order that you need to understand what it is for something to be essentially F, the most plausible account that I know is this one, that necessarily for any X is essentially F, just in case necessarily if it exists, it's intrinsically F. So putting it kind of crudely, the essential properties of a thing, it's necessarily intrinsic properties, given that it exists. Now, on that account of what it is, of what being essentially F it amounts to, it turns out that existing is one of the essential properties, right? If you go back and think about it, what I said was necessarily if it exists. Sorry, go back, necessarily for anything, it's essentially F, just in case necessarily if it exists, it's intrinsically F, right? And it follows directly from that existence is going to be one of the, talking a way that I prefer not to, existence is one of the essential properties. Now, you might not like that way of accounting for what essential properties are. We could argue about the merits of it, but if it's correct, then it just isn't true that essence, and to speak in your terminology, that essence and existence are distinct. Rather, existence is just part of essence. To say it in a different way, things only have essential properties, and they only exist if they exist, right? There aren't any non-existent things. There aren't essences out there waiting to be joined to existence, right? On my view, I mean, I take it that your view bears a kind of family resemblance to Meinong's view, that there are lots of things that in some sense have being but don't exist. That's where the essences are. They're distinct, right? The uninstantiated essences are. And so I just don't accept any of that kind of metaphysics. And so I would want to cut this kind of argument off right at the beginning with the idea that there really is this distinction between the existence of a thing on one hand and its essential properties on the other hand, because actually its existing just is one of its essential properties.
So before you jump back in, Ed, we're going to have to cut it down. So basically what I think we're going to do at this point is take a couple minutes, respond to what he just said, and then from there we'll do closing remarks, and then we'll jump to the Q&A.
Okay. So I mean, there's a lot there, and there are all kinds of complex metaphysical issues that arise here. And one of them is that Graham won't be surprised to hear me say this, that I wouldn't accept that account of essence. So I don't think of an essence as a bundle of properties, for example. The essence is what grounds the properties, and so on and so forth. But even bracketing all that off, I mean, and I also think that the argument can be run without having to get into the question of the ontological status of essences. Are we thinking of them as Meinongian? Are we thinking of them as Platonic and so forth? I think that, at least to a large extent, the argument can be run by bracketing that off. But putting those points aside, I mean, the first objection that occurs to me to Graham's position is that if we make a thing's existence part of its essence, then we seem to make of everything essentially a necessarily existing thing. That if it's part of the thing's very essence that it exists, then it's no longer really a contingent thing. It's got a kind of a necessary being to it. And once we say that, well, for one thing, it's a strange thing to say about any material object. And secondly, if we're going to press it and say that a material object is really a necessary rather than a contingent thing, then it's going to be hard to avoid some kind of theism, even if it's a pantheism, according to which the objects of our experience are really, because they're really necessary beings, and only misperceived by us as contingent, that our awareness of material reality is really a kind of confused awareness of God understood in a pantheist way.
So now I have to hear how Graham is going to respond to that, and then we'll move to closing.
Okay, so the way that I'm thinking about essences, the only things that have essences are existing things. That's why existence turns out to be part of essence. But lots of existing things exist only contingently. There's nothing in the view that commits me to the idea that just because, as you might say, existence is part of essence, that therefore everything exists of necessity. That just simply doesn't follow from the view. The view is a view about going back to the idea that what's fundamental here is the distinction between being essentially a certain kind of way and being accidentally a certain kind of way, right? And adding that to what some people would call existentialism, the view that the only things that there are things that exist, right? So that you don't have the domain of non-existence. That's how I got the conclusions out. So I'm not worried about the idea that this is going to commit me to everything existing of necessity. I just think that doesn't follow.
Well, I want to. I don't know, Cameron, you want me to respond to this or not, or fold it into a closing statement. Maybe I can do that. Fold it
Okay.
into a
All
closing
right. Well, let me do this then.
statement, and then Graham can give Graham the last word. But
Yeah.
it's up to you.
Yeah. I like to do last words to the non-Christian guests anyway, so this is great. All right, I
No
just wanted to
problem.
remind everyone that we're going to do a Patreon only Q&A right after this. We're going to end this one in about 5-10 minutes, and then we're going to move to our Patreon to do live Q&A. If you want to be part of the question and answer period of this discussion, the link to that is in the description. And with that, go ahead and take it away, Ed. Just take about 5 minutes, summarize where we've been, and also if you want to add a response in there, you can. And then we'll move to Graham, and then we'll close this part of the discussion out.
All right. So, whatever the details of Graham's own distinct account of essence, it seems to me like, as at least in common with other accounts of essence, that the essence of a thing is what makes it what it is, and what it could not exist without. And so, if we include existence within the essence of a thing, including of a physical object, then we're really saying that the existence of anything, including any physical object, is going to be part of what it is to be that thing, and that it could not be without. It wouldn't be a stone or an apple, say, if it didn't have existence, because existence is part of the essence, and the essence of a thing is what it is. The apple or the stone is what it is to be an apple or a stone. So I'm not clear still on how he can avoid this conclusion that everything ultimately ends up existing of necessity, with all of the implications that's going to have. So folding this into just a general closing statement, I guess I want to say that, in my opinion, the ultimate dispute between atheism and theism is probably going to lead us in something like the kind of outcome we've had in just our hour and a half discussion here, which is that we're either going to end up pressing the project of explanation as far as it can go to the bottom metaphysical level, in which case we're going to get to something that exists of necessity. And whether we think of it as God or not, or we think of it as just laws of nature, we think of it as ultimate simples or what have you, when we unpack it, we're going to find that it's going to bear very strong resemblance, or even really be identical to God as conceived of in the classical theist tradition, as conceived of by an Aristotelian or a Thomist or a Neoplatonist or someone like that. Or we're going to, in order to avoid that, going to have to back away from the project of ultimate explanation and end up with some kind of brute fact position, which would violate the principle of sufficient reason, which is something we didn't really have time to get into. Yeah. But where I think that position is, for reasons I get into in the book, is ultimately incoherent. It's ultimately something, especially if you're going to pursue science, which I think always, at least implicitly, is committed to some version of the principle of sufficient reason. It's going to undermine the position of any atheist who takes it. You're going to have to avoid theism. You're ultimately going to have to deny principle of sufficient reason, but that's going to ultimately commit you also to denying the things you want to affirm, including the explanatory efficacy of science and so forth. That's what I think the dispute between the two views ultimately boils down to. But anyway, I'll leave it to Graham now to give us the last word.
Okay, so I should respond to something that you just said, I think. So on my view, the way that I think about necessity is brute, right? So if you say something's necessarily the case, I can explain why it is the case by appealing to its necessity. But then if you ask me, why is it necessary? We've reached rock bottom. There's no further thing to be said. Every position ends up finding things that are brute. And in fact, there's a kind of question about whether you should prefer brute contingencies to brute necessities. I prefer myself brute necessities, but lots of people don't. Where does the necessity come in the view that I prefer? Because we didn't really explore this question very much. I think that there's, if you think about natural reality, and suppose, as seems reasonable to me, that it's got an initial part, then the initial part will be necessary. So every possible world shares some initial history with the actual world, branches from it, diverges from it only because chances play out differently. The evolution of the world's not deterministic. That's the kind of basic picture I've got. So I do have a necessity in there, and I see this view as being consistent with the principle of sufficient reason, at least a correct version of it, because it turns out that pretty much everything has an explanation. Of course, where you've got indeterminism, you're going to have only partial explanation, right? So if you've got an indeterministic cause, there are various ways things could have gone. Why did it go one way rather than another? Well, there's no answer to that, but you've still got a partial explanation of why this thing happened. Namely, there was this earlier thing, and there are various ways things could have gone, and it just happened to go this way. I don't see that, and many theists agree with this, that that's not a violation of the principle of sufficient reason either, right? I mean, to force determinism, if the principle of sufficient reason entails determinism, most people worry, most theists that I know worry about that. So it better be that you can have indeterminism. So in actual fact, I don't think that the way that this ends up playing out is going to be something that forces atheists into an unfavourable position, but obviously there's way more to talk about. Okay.
Yeah, and that's why we're going to do a part 2 if we can get it scheduled, right? So just wanted to remind everyone that we are going to be moving just in about 5 minutes to a live Q&A on our Patreon. And some of you guys were asking in the live chat whether or not that will be available for people to watch who aren't patrons, and the answer is yes, that will be available. However, it's not going to be available for maybe a month or 2. I'm not exactly sure. This is all very new to me, how this is all going to work, but it will be available to the public at some point. So this is more like an early access thing, and if you want to ask questions, you've got to be a patron. So it will be available to everyone, just not right now. Basically, that's what's going to go down. But I wanted to thank you guys for both coming on. It's been an awesome discussion. I know that we're usually with these things, we're only able to scratch the surface. So, but yeah, thanks for coming out.
Thank you. And thank you,
Thanks.
Graham. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you. And yes, we did only just scratch the surface, but still.
Yeah. So the next time, part 2, we'll have to get a little bit more organized and see how we can sort of parse these things out. Maybe spend a certain amount of time on stuff. But anyways, we've already got a lot of questions that are popping up. So let's go ahead and switch over, and we'll see you guys in just a little bit.